There's a 33% increase of marriages on the day of 21st day in September, and they're basing it around that song. So people are feeling influenced. They want to connect with the song. So when you played that, Ava, I thought it was perfect for this scenario. That song, September, has 1.7 billion streams on Spotify. So anyway, pointless facts that you now know. No need to thank me. But I am actually kicking this off today. The commissioner will be joining us. He is not here yet. We have a commissioner who loves to be out and about. So he is currently traveling around the state, and he is pulling up to the place where he needs to be so that he can join us. So we will hear from him later. Just to kick it off, the task force this week is focusing on parental oversight of district devices is the main topic. This is our second week on that topic, and this will be the last week, generally speaking, the last week we do one of these panels. So starting next week, we will start moving into the creative side of making that report and getting that where it needs to be. As a reminder, in November, Ava and Brian are going to go before the board and present this report, and it will go to them in November, and then they can act on it or choose what they do in December. So that's kind of the outline of where we are. Next week, we'll have more of we'll kind of outline you the rest of the process of how we are going to get where we need to be. So without any further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Ava, and she'll get us started.
Thank you, Jake. We will get started by going over the conversations from the breakout rooms last week and highlight any policy recommendations that came up during those conversations. So we'll have Gabby take it away to report on the breakout rooms.
Okay, thanks, Ava. So last week's breakout rooms really seemed to focus on the common thread of educating parents, specifically on parental controls, setting healthy boundaries and communicating why boundaries are set, and then ensuring parents have guidance but are supported in setting expectations for their children. Recommendations were discussed for schools and districts to provide clear training and guidance to parents on how to use parental control features and monitoring tools, especially when school-owned devices are sent home with students. That included ensuring resources were available to parents in languages they speak at different times that work best for parents and in different formats. Several groups also noted that it would be ideal for parents to have access that mirrors the level of access and controls available for their students on devices. And groups discussed again that recommendations may be best developed by age or grade level, such as recommendations designed for elementary, middle, and high school. So we've heard that come up several weeks, so we'll continue to track that as something the group might be interested in. And I think I'll hand it back to Brian.
All right. Thank you, Gabby. Next on our agenda is the research review this week. So I'm going to pass it over to Peyton to share this with us.
Okay, so in developing research for this week, really wanted to kind of base it off some of the conversations that we started having last week, particularly when it comes to uh, parents and kind of their understanding of the devices that students are bringing home, and what those relationships might look like. Um, so I know we talked a little bit about this starting last week, but I wanted to get into some discussion on acceptable use policies for district devices. So every district that gives their students devices, at least most of them, probably have some kind of acceptable use policy telling students what they can or cannot do with those devices. How to use them and what the rules around that use is. And so I went through and reviewed a kind of a random sampling of acceptable use policies from districts in Kansas, and really noted positive versus negative language being used in those policies. So in some cases, we had lists of 10 to 25 things that were told that kids cannot do. So, you know, you cannot use, for example, technology resources for non-educational purposes. And this list would go on, sometimes for up to 25 rules of saying that these acts are prohibited. So there was kind of a lot of that more negative language versus the positive language of this is what you can or this is what you should be doing with this technology that might be helpful or educational. And then I also looked at these policies in terms of how they were written and who they were written for. So I did a review of 10 random Kansas districts and put all of their policies through a reading level generator. That generator used 5 different reading level scales. And so I took the 5 different scores that it gave me and did an average of those. So based on these 10 district acceptable use policies, the average reading level was about 12th grade, with the lowest reading level of all of them being at about a 10th grade level, and the highest of them all needing about 13 and a half years of education to fully understand what that policy was saying and how it was written. And then something to note here is that 54% of US adults read below a 6th grade level, and the average reading level of US adults is 7th to 8th grade. So, when we're writing those acceptable use policies for kids and their parents, it's, pretty clear based on some of this evidence that maybe sometimes those policies aren't actually being written with the right audience in mind. And then just to talk a little bit about one-to-one devices and how they go home and in what ways they interact with parents and families at homes. So in looking at different policies, not only from Kansas, but kind of around the country, seems to me that there are about 3 different options that a lot of schools use as far as their one-to-one devices go. The first of those being that there's kind of a no opt-out policy. So this would mean that the school district says, we have this one-to-one device program, and we do not have an option for you to opt your child out of getting one of those devices. And so then the student kind of has to take whatever device the school gives them. The other option here is take home opt out, which basically means that the student can have the device at school. So they'll issue them a device just like everyone else, but they have some kind of infrastructure in place that allows the students to keep those devices at school and not bring them home overnight, and then charge them at school as well. A lot of these situations had parents have to sign a waiver saying that, yes, I understand kind of the consequences of not letting my child bring the computer home, and I don't want them to bring it home, and I want them to keep it at school. And then the last option, which actually there are not a lot of districts that I found that had this kind of even outlined as an option for their students, is kind of this full opt-out of the one-to-one program. So this particular school had also a waiver that parents would have to sign saying that we understand the consequences of not allowing our student to have one of these school-issued devices, and that might affect your student's ability to work with their peers, do homework at school, and be able to have the skills necessary to live in a digital world. So parents would have to sign a waiver, and then there would be some kind of accommodations made for those students who fully opt out of receiving a district device. But like I said, there were not very many districts that I found that really outlined this as even being an option on their websites. So that is all I had for this week, and I can kick it back to Brian and Ava.
All right. Thank you, Peyton. We're going to move on to this week's panel presentation, and I'd like to introduce our panelists that we have with us today. First is Dean Mance, who is the Technology Coordinator at Sterling USD 376. Our second panelist is Dr. Beth Rabbit, who is the CEO of the Learning Accelerator. And our third panelist that will be joining us today is Christopher Rinkus, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education of the U.S. Department of Education. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Ava.
Thank you, Brian. We will have each of our panelists start by talking about their background and then provide us some of their initial thoughts on tools and strategies that are available to assist in providing oversight to parents of school-issued devices. So we will go ahead and get started with Dean Mance.
Thank you, ma'am. As they said in the introductions, I'm Dean Mance. I'm Technology Coordinator for Sterling USD 376. This is my 32nd year in education and being a teacher and being on the IT side. Back in early 2003, when I was in a previous school district, we were one of the first school districts at that time to go one-to-one with PC laptops in grades 7 through 12. So my experience with one-to-one and the ability of the kids taking them home and all of that, has been, you're looking at 21 years, give or take. So that's kind of some of the background. I am a parent of 3 kids. Matter of fact, my oldest daughter's a teacher at Royal Valley. My son's in college now, and then I've got a 10-year-old at home. So kind of a wide range. As far as what we currently do here in Sterling is with our Chromebooks, we are technically grades 2 through 12, one-to-one with Chromebooks. The students in grades 7 and 8 have their Chromebooks where they're all kept in cabinets. They come into their success period, which starts the day. And then at the end of the day, if there's a need for them to take them home, they check them out through their success teacher. And then in the high school, obviously, they're responsible for their Chromebooks. Our content filter is also working on the students' Chromebooks away from home, because that was what our community wanted to see done rather than not be filtered away from school. So we've done that. Now, back in 21, if I remember correctly, when we switched to our current content filter, they also have a piece where the parents can monitor from at home. We did a little beta testing with a small group, and some of them liked it. Some of them are like not really interested. So we haven't truly pursued it, but that's also partially because I am the only IT person for our entire school district. So one thing to keep in mind is, with these policies that may be potentially handed down is what kind of funding there may be included for especially small rural school districts that do only have one person or don't have a true dedicated IT person to provide support. Because I know from my own personal experience, like I said, for 21 years of one-to-one, there's a lot of time when parents want to reach you out or contact you after hours, and then that takes away from you and your own personal life. But then also being a parent, in some cases, their parents deserve or should have some of that opportunity, but again, that's just me kind of wanting to put it out there. There's got to be a balance and some kind of consideration for those small rural school districts that do not have the IT staff that would be needed to train parents and support parents.
Awesome. Next, we are going to move to Dr. Beth Rabbit.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I just want to start by applauding you all for diving so deeply into a topic that is very nuanced and that we're still learning a lot about. Just in terms of background for me, my name is Beth Rabbit. I am based in Portland, Maine, slightly far away from Kansas. I have been working in the world of education innovation for the last 20 years, and I currently run a national nonprofit that's focused on helping schools and systems across the country explore innovation and improvement and to learn from each other as quickly as possible. I've been a classroom teacher as well as a school administrator. I'll also note at present time, I am the parent of 2 elementary and middle school aged daughters. So this topic is one I experience personally and grapple with. When I was invited to join you all today, I was encouraged to offer a little bit more of the national kind of research take here. I do want to acknowledge my research is independently supported, so not funded by technology companies, and is very much focused on how do we understand the risks and the potential benefits of using new tools like these in schools, and how do we maximize outcomes for learners. Want to note, like, first thing is, I'm sure you've heard this from other panelists, screens are a vehicle for experience. Screens can be neither good nor bad, and it really matters how we're using them in the context of kids and their learning. And so when we're talking about whether they're good or bad, oftentimes our national conversations can be little bit blunt, but at the level of the educational community, we have to really dig in to get more serious about what do we mean, which screens, why, when, and as we set policies for them, educate parents around some of that nuance. Quality matters way more than necessarily quantity. We know specific behaviors such as active use, engaging with others around technology, have very strong positive cognitive and social emotional outcomes for learners. We know that passive learning, we know that overemphasis on kind of just screen time alone can have negative outcomes. As we begin to pull things apart, it's really important that we talk about not just like the vehicle of the screen, but also the applications and purposes of use. So for example, social media use, our policies have to address the fact that for our younger teenagers, they are associated with some negative mental health outcomes, although a lot of the data we have is very early and it's not causal, meaning it's associated, but we actually don't know whether or not the devices we're using and their features are in fact causing or simply just more used by teenagers or even adults who have those experiences. So when we think about these policies and how they get understood at the level of community and the potential burdens we're placing on administrators like Dean, it's really important that we educate ourselves together and engage in a little of that complexity. In terms of what we are seeing nationally, there are a couple things I'd highlight for you all. The first is, as we're moving to establish these local policies, we really need to address the fact that there are huge gaps emerging between parental perceptions and support for school devices, inclusive of mobile phones, and how educators feel. There have been a couple of surveys actually released this summer and last week that have found that the vast majority of parents are actually supportive of technology and mobile phones in school with boundaries for learning. And in fact, 56% of educators are similarly supportive. So as we talk about rolling out policies, it's critically important then that we actually engage families and students along with our educators to understand, why are we doing this? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? When parents have been asked if they've been engaged around their school's technologies policies, only 30% have responded affirmatively. And so what that means is we're not actually engaging them enough to have support coming from home and alignment around our policies. The second thing I just want to call out is we haven't necessarily been as nuanced as possible in terms of our developmentally appropriate restrictions. What is true for a second grader or for my 11-year-old should very much be different from a 12th grader, who in fact needs to start learning the skills, the engagement skills, the digital literacy skills, and the self-moderation skills to be using these tools as tools in workforce and future learning. We focus a lot on policies that restrict, but we should also be focusing on policies that actually require our schools to increasingly educate kids and give them opportunities to learn and to potentially fail in a highly supportive manner, rather than not have any engagement at all. The last thing that I want to say is just, as we're considering this topic, we really need to balance the risk and reward and social benefits we might potentially see from using technology in the form of assistive devices, in the form of supporting at-home learning, particularly for those students who do not have that technology access already at home. Typically, our students who are coming from families who have lower incomes or might be operating actually in settings like rural settings where they have just less access to these technologies on the whole. And so just wanted to offer those couple of bigger frames for things that we're seeing as we're working with districts across the country. And as you're considering in particular the impact on schools and what we're asking them to do, to Dean's point, balancing a little bit of like the burden on schools of controlling this versus the potential benefit from a learning and like community engagement standpoint.
Thank you, Beth. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So my name is Chris Rinkus. I live in Washington, D.C. Hope you guys won't hold that against me. And I'm, really excited to talk to you all because I've been in and around education for over 10 years, and I have a real fondness for talking to actual practitioners. I understand lots of researchers and industry reps and all sorts of folks probably tell you guys how it is, but I think there's nothing more valuable than hearing from the folks on the ground. So I'm particularly excited for that. I mentioned, I've been in education for a while. I spent over 7 years at the DC public schools here in Washington, D.C. I was at the U.S. Department of Education for 4 years. And then in recent years, I've been working in industry, but pretty squarely focused on issues related to kids and technology. Um, I worked for a company called GoGuardian, which is pretty active in the internet content filtering space. Although I'm really not here to advocate for one particular company or solution, I think there's a lot of good solutions out there. And what I do want to raise awareness about is the lessons that I learned from that experience at GoGuardian and what I was hearing from people out in the field. Um, I will share after my remarks, but one thing that we did while I was there was conduct a scientific poll of both parents, teachers, and school administrators, asking them questions about young people and school devices specifically. And why I find this research to be so helpful is I actually don't feel that there's much out there related to young people and the school devices. Beth mentioned, I think you can often find good information about young people and personal devices, young people and technology in general. But this question about how we manage school devices, how we keep kids safe on school devices, and how we keep parents informed is something that I still think is very much emerging. And so I wanted to share a couple of the top line findings because they stood out to me. So when we did this scientific poll, and it was nationally representative, so made up of respondents that are designed to accurately represent the makeup of schools as a whole, we found that 75% of parents were concerned about their kids accessing harmful content, specifically through a school device. We registered overall concerns for children's mental health as very high. We found beliefs that mental health is directly impacted by what young people are experiencing online. And we also found that most parents think that there is, in fact, a need for schools to invest in technology to prevent children from accessing harmful content. One other point I'll make, sort of a quick parenthetical on this. This survey was in the field in late 2022. So this also isn't data from years ago. This is really from close to the present at a point at which we've distributed devices to over 90% of kids. And we're still registering overwhelming numbers of parents as concerned about what their kids can access on that device. And so that suggests to me that the status quo is insufficient to meet parents' level of concern when it comes to young people in these devices, and suggestive of the fact that we probably need more and perhaps better, more comprehensive solutions. I'll sort of close out here just with one or two other points. Within that same survey, we found significant interest among parents for advanced technology, including AI-powered technology, machine learning-powered technology that can anticipate students who might be experiencing distress or even crisis based on clues like their online behavior. Um, so, for instance, if a child was repeatedly searching for harmful content, or to be even more specific, if they were perhaps Googling how to hurt themselves or how to hurt someone else, these parents responded that they would be interested in technology that could detect that and send an alert to either the parent or to a school administrator who could ideally intervene before the kid does something they really regret. And I want to close with sort of that because I assume based on the nature of this group, many of you agree are to use basic internet content filtering tools to make sure that kids can't access, what one might consider to be garden variety harmful content. And that's good. And that probably wasn't true, even just 5 years ago. But I also think now we have this opportunity to go further to help make sure that kids are being kept as safe as possible. And I do think there is something of a responsibility on the part of both parents and schools to do that because so quickly we've allowed these school issued devices to become ubiquitous. Um, and if you think about it in that context, I actually think there's a real opportunity to consider how we secure kids' digital experiences on the same lines as we're considering very often now how we ensure kids' physical safety in the school facility. Because frankly, when we think about unfortunate incidents like school violence or instances of self-harm, more often than not, young people are leaving clues online, digital footprints about what they might be thinking and doing. And certainly those clues might only appear on a personal device, but it's very plausible. And anecdotally, we heard this time and time again at Go Guardian, kids are seeking out this same type of thing on the school device. And in fact, in certain instances, it's almost a perverse incentive where it's easier for parents to regularly monitor their young people on a personal device and harder to do it on a school device, thus incentivizing the kid to potentially seek this type of content out on a school device. And I think that's an outcome that we all really want to avoid. So I'll wrap up there, but happy to take questions. I'll drop the link to that research in the chat, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're now going to go ahead and open up for questions from the rest of the task force. So like usual, if you guys could raise your hands, we'll make sure to get to your questions. You can go ahead, Melanie.
Thank you, Ava, and thank you all for being here today. My question, well, really for whomever wants to answer it, I would like for you to talk just a little bit more about what it looks like to restrict traffic using tools like GoGuardian. And Dean, you mentioned that you had implemented a tool, but you didn't call it out by name. What does the task force need to know about how those tools work to filter content? And I'll give you part of what I'm looking for is blacklist versus whitelist and customizing options. Thanks.
Well, I'll go ahead and kind of start with our current product. The nice thing is if we were to go ahead and completely distribute or make it accessible, let me put it that way, to parents that want it, they would be able to pause the internet on the school issued device after school hours. Plus, it also gives them the right to put it on a personally owned device, which then allows them to manage more features of the personally owned device. But right now, as far as, like you said, blacklist, whitelist, when the students are at home or wherever and they have it connected to the internet, it is the exact same content filter that they would have within the school walls. So that way, since it is school-owned device, we're a public school, we get E-rate funding, we have to meet some of those regulations to where the filtering is in place for adult materials and some other, categories that I won't really get into, but most of you would understand where I'm coming from. So that's kind of where those things are. So there is that flexibility to where with this, the parents can see what's going on the school device after school hours, pause the internet, put it on their own child's personal device, and then be able to have even additional control.
This is Chris. I'll just add a point or two here. I mentioned I worked for a company in the space. I do think there are multiple good vendors in the space. I'll just call it briefly by name. Gaggle, LineWise, GoGuardian. I think all have high quality products. I do think Dean raised an important point earlier, which is all of these products come at a cost, and so how that is funded and sustained is an important question to ask because I have also met with folks at the school level and at the state level where the switching between um, applications is particularly burdensome. So I do think that's a big important question to wrestle with. But generally speaking, I think the ideal, as far as I'm concerned with this, is somewhat similar to what Dean described. I mean, you want to have a basic prevent list that prevents kids from accessing what I think generally is agreed upon to be harmful content, adult content, extremely violent content, things of that nature. Um, I think the thornier questions, but again, important ones to grapple with are what about these big gray areas? What about TikTok? What about YouTube, or what about YouTube after certain hours of the day? And so the company that I worked for did have customizations that could allow for some of those finer grain distinctions. I'm sure the other providers do as well. But if I were in an IT director's shoes, those would be some of the things that I would really drill down into alongside my community, because I just think the bottom line is there's a reason why technology policies are different district to district. There's a reason why that policy making is delegated down to the district level. Um, you're going to have to figure out what's exactly right for that particular community. But I think, I guess, final point, like I do think we're past the point of just importing default settings from a vendor and having that be what it is. I do think we have to ask ourselves these questions. And, I hope perhaps that TikTok example might be one that prompts some thinking, because if you ask people around the country or even around Kansas, I think you probably have a different answer about to what degree you might want kids to access that. And we know that's true across a wide spectrum of websites, and the tools can accommodate it. It's more a question of what do you want them to prevent, limit, or throttle access to.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you to our panelists for answering Melanie's question. It looks like Kim has her hand up with another question for you guys.
Yes, I'm curious from Dean and Chris on the contract with the company that you work with, Dean, or GoGuardian, Chris, what the contract says, the standard contract about student data. Who stores that data, and is it sold to third parties?
I'll go ahead and just start from there. When we kind of look at that, and to be honest with you, you bring up student data privacy in general too. That's a big thing that I've been, I won't say battling, but trying to bring to the forefront for our entire staff when it comes to, wide open, sign up, just use whatever you want type thing. So if you were to look, our product that we're currently using already meets several of the child data privacy, COPA, FERPA regulations that are out there. So typically when a teacher would ask, and I know this doesn't necessarily answer your question, but it kind of hopefully gives you a little background of how we try to protect the student data or student privacy, is that when we're looking at those, we're trying to see what does it collect. And there may be something that's a good quality product, but if it's collecting information, providing advertisements, and they're going to sell it to a third party, I don't care what the content is, it's student data privacy concern. So that's where we fall it in. So I have a fairly strict, in my opinion, vetting process. We'll use like One Ed Tech. We also are working on a national data privacy agreement There's a NDPA that's out there that school districts can use to submit to vendors. And then I know some of the school districts that I kind of bounce off and say, hey, have you approved this? Here's my concerns. What concerns have you had? We'll do a lot of that communication. And sometimes they'll say a vendor will not sign that DPA, but we're not going to use that vendor. So the one product that we are currently uses already meets and has signed that agreement.
And I'm sorry, Dean, did you say what that product was?
That we're currently using for content filtering, line wise.
Line wise?
Yeah. I've
Thank you.
had experience with multiple content filters, so.
This is Chris. I think Dean's answer was excellent. I would view it as this, you should trust but verify. I can tell you that my experience with all of these vendors is that they are built with privacy in mind. They're all FERPA and COPPA compliant. These products are, I guess to extrapolate a little bit, they're slightly different than classroom tools insofar as there's really no incentive for the, I mean, they're not allowed to, but there's also really no incentive for them to manipulate, sell, market data. These are more like functional utilities that are meant to assist traditionally IT administrators, although now it's kind of a wider audience. And so there really would be no profit in selling that data. All that said, you should do your due diligence, like Dean mentioned, and I think those certifications are really key. One EdTech is a great one. That's a way that you can also probe this question of trust without having to do all of the extensive research exclusively yourself. And so I would certainly use something like What EdTech as a resource. I'll just make one final point. Um, this question about data and privacy obviously comes up because uh, we're talking about young people and things like internet activity. Um, and so that is important. That said, and I think Dean touched this slightly, I'll kind of say directly, I don't work for a school district, so maybe I have a little more flexibility. Like there is a different expectation of privacy in these school devices. It's the difference between the school locker and the closet at your house. And so although I think good people can disagree on the extent to which these types of software tools should be used to monitor internet activity. I think what's not especially debatable is the fact that school districts have at least some responsibility imposed on them. For instance, if they accept E-rate funding to block this kind of content. And I think that there's a plausible case to be made that school districts can and should do more because of what I said in my opening about the fact that we know kids are at risk for content online that doesn't fall into traditional categories of, um, they're not necessarily objectionable, but at the same time, I have two daughters. I wouldn't want them accessing a text forum where they talk with other people about how to hurt themselves in very specific ways, which unfortunately does exist online. And so, I do think we have to be really thoughtful about how to both respect this data, but when possible, put this data to good use in a way that can actually help young people. And I think some of what I'm describing is this effort to, in fact, put this data to good use, towards sort of a noble purpose, which is, I think, preventing harm and even instances of violence occasionally.
So I would argue that since COPPA and FERPA are over 25 years old, they really aren't doing a good job to address these issues, right? We don't have current laws that really address where we've come with these products.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's debatable. COPPA was regulated in 2014. There's FTC rulemakings potentially underway for additional updates. Congress is debating COPPA 2.0 past the Senate. Yes, but also I don't think there's anything in COPPA that would facilitate widespread transfer of young people's data to third parties in a way that does in fact exist with lots of consumer products. So, don't get me wrong there. I think when you introduce the wider world of consumer tech, there are lots and lots of privacy risks. I think ed tech is a much narrower universe. I think when they find violations, it's people that are running directly afoul, even of those old laws, not coming up with new and novel ways sort of around them. So I take your point, but I actually think COPPA and FERPA even though they haven't been revisited as often as they should, are not completely antiquated. The bottom line is what I think it imposes, is responsibilities around what schools should be doing when they give access to the internet to young people. And I don't know that those standards necessarily need to be all that different in 2024 than they were back in 2001. I mean, this is about objectionable content for the most part.
Thank you both.
Okay, it looks like Amy has a question for our panel.
Yep, thanks. Beth, this one is to you, and it's a follow-up from a comment, mostly because it's something that I hear sometimes as like a throwaway. There's not too much, there's no such thing as like too much screen time. It's just what are you doing with it? And I know there's some discussion in the chat, so maybe you guys can follow up on that. Isn't there there's too much screen time, and where would you draw the line when you're making recommendations? Because taking into account context and what it's displacing, but then also we've got a lot more information about even children's eyesight and myopia increasing and obesity rates and things like that. What for parental controls and how we go into moderating time online as much as content, what would you guys suggest districts address?
So the tricky thing which you're pointing to is that we have to look at screen time within the total context of kids' development and learning. What the research is pretty clear on is that if you and I are interacting across a screen and we are engaged in dialogue and high quality activity, that type of learning, that type of experience is no worse than if we are in the same space. Now, it requires good facilitation and things like that, but the research hasn't found that to be true. As it relates to myopia research, that was actually associated with kids spending time outside, right? And so kids who were not spending time inside and were learning on screens were not leaving their home residences. Yes, we saw impacts on eyesight and so forth like that, but it relates to like the total experience a kid is having. And so I think as we think about our policies around how much screen use we have, the choices parents are making at home around how much they're allowing their kids to engage in additional screen time, some of which might be low quality. And by low quality, I mean passively watching television, scrolling, not interacting, oftentimes alone. Like, yes, we can have too much quantity, but it does in fact relate to what you are doing with the technology that relates most to like the negative impacts. When technology is displacing other things we need, exercise, time outside, for a lot of teenagers, interaction with others or sleep, those do have negative effects. And I don't want to downsize that, but I mean, I think that it's difficult to create blunt policies that can address all of that. And so I think it's important that we as a sector talk about what good learning looks like, what positive uses are. We teach kids to self-moderate in the same way we would do so with eating or exercise or sleep. I don't think that we can rely on tools like GoGuardian necessarily to do that work that we need to do as communities.
You don't mind me adding on to that. This is where, like I said, 32 plus years of education, parent of 3, having been involved with one-to-one since 2003, basically. This is where I got 2 hats. One is a parent. I'm on top of my kids. And if I feel like they've had too much technology, get off of it, get outside, let's go do something. You and I could do something. Let's get a book, let's do it. It's the parental involvement, engagement, being a partner, I guess you could say, to a certain level in that kind of thing. And the IT side of me says it shouldn't be my role as an IT director to have to manage the child's technology access outside of the school, for the simple fact that that is parent family time I should have my own parent family time and not have to give up that time to be around, to be accessible for other parents that in some ways use the technology to be the babysitter. And I know that may ruffle some feathers, but that again, that's just my personal feeling. And I know I've had a lot of other, educators and non-educators kind of that way too, that, hey, you've been on this device or doing that stuff enough. Let's go do something different.
I'm agreeing with you on that having those separate. I wonder sometimes when we, like, since we're doing guidance not just for the families that have parents at home that are able to be present and have the awareness of all these topics, but for the kids who don't have as much oversight at home, is there a point where the school districts adjust how they're using screens into school to accommodate for how most kids use screens outside of the school? That's the kind of like other weird part of it, but I think I jumped in front of Tana. So,
well, I'll just kind of touch on yours real quick, Amy. I know in my school district where I'm currently at, even though the kids have the Chromebooks accessible, they're not on it all the time. I would lay you odds if we surveyed our teachers, the vast majority of the teachers, the kids are off of it more than they're on it.
Okay, thank you guys for answering those questions. We're going to move to Katie real quick because she's not able to use her raise hand button, but she has a question for you guys, and then we'll get to Tana.
Thank you, Ava. I'm just kind of building on the last two questions. I do hear a lot about parental concerns about what kids are accessing, but also parental concerns about maybe that's not the right way for their kid to be learning. So I'm wondering if you could think about that in terms of the policy options that Peyton laid out at the beginning of the session, where, it's complete opt-out. You can't opt out at all or opt out from home. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe this is a Beth question, but any of you could answer.
Well, I'll answer it real quick on my end. We've never said parents had to. If a parent wants to say no, they say no. Part of our enrollment thing is at the beginning, the parents have the option to say yes or no on internet access, yes and no on being able to use the Google account. They have all those options at enrollment. We lay it all out there, letting them know about student data privacy and how we kind of keep this secure and under the age of 13 versus 18 and older, all those things. But we've never said that the parents can't come in and say that, no, we don't want this coming home. I know in previous years in my other school district, we had parents that did that. Okay, the laptops didn't go home. They were turned in at the office. So, I understand the opt-in, opt-out option questions, but I don't know a school district that would force it upon the family or the kid just because they don't have that form. If they don't want it, then it doesn't go home.
I do think there's so obviously I have total agreement with Dean there. We don't tend to see any districts that don't have opt-in or opt-out policies. To the question though of like how technology is being used during school time, bluntly, I think that's where we have to defer to our educators and their professional judgment about the tools that are getting used in their classrooms to support students. There are many students who benefit a ton from assistive devices, from applications that allow them to access content at different levels, particularly post-pandemic, running a classroom of 25 kids and being able to differentiate to all of them. That's a place where technology can be incredibly helpful, kids' ability to create using computers. So there are a lot of good pedagogical reasons to be using tech in the classroom. And I think that's where, again, there are very few instances where we walk into a classroom and teachers are overusing technology. The best example I can think of is my own education and having a coach for health who played like a television, right? Like we don't do that in schools too often. So I just want to point out that schools are pretty good about the decisions they're making around how to use these tools.
Okay, thank you guys for answering those questions. Next up, Tana, you can go ahead and ask your question to our different presenters.
So this kind of follows along with what Katie said. I'm an English language learner teacher, and so I see a great benefit in some ways of that technology with kids who are developing language. But I do worry, and I don't know how this is addressed when we send, where is the balance? Because when I send those computers home, they're often going home to families who don't speak English, right? More often than not. And so the way that we communicate what we expect work to be done. There may already be a difficulty with the kids acquiring and learning things that their parents had never learned to begin with, right? There's a gap often in there. And so I wonder how we balance using that technology, sending it home, expecting homework or things to be done on that technology at home, in homes where parents aren't equipped to even guide their children without the technology, let alone. And is there a way that that's addressed, or what does the research kind of say on how that helps or doesn't help or could hinder? I hope that question made sense.
I'm just, I know we have some teachers that will provide a lot of alternate options to where they could go out and get this additional help. I know, especially at the grade school, we've got a number of teachers that we use Clever. So a lot of them will put a lot of those resources on their teacher page within Clever, whether it's Khan Academy to help explain some math stuff, or another foreign language thing, or a translator, something in there to kind of help out. We have one English teacher that does the Shakespeare site, where we work and get parental permission for them, the students, to have counsel in there to kind of help go and get information there to help as they read. So the teachers that truly, I don't want to say, make this sound like a knock against all teachers, but you have some of those teachers that go out and beyond what some others do. And I see that with a lot of my teachers, and they'll take advantage of that stuff and put those additional resources out there. Our media specialist for the school district, she has got such a vast wealth of resources out there for those type of things, or audio books and just other ways so they can hear the English language being spoken to them as they read the book. So, I mean, that's how we try to do that a lot for it. Now, the school district I'm currently in, we're in a small rural community that is very, very little ELA. Over the last 2-3 years, it's kind of taken off between Ukrainian kids coming in through church missionary stuff, or some of the people that are in a community where I used to be north of here, that even there in the last 5-10 years, the ELA populations just exploded. So, I mean, from the teacher side, a lot of our teachers will provide those options and resources to them if they're asking for it or need it.
And sorry, I'm going to jump in again. And the software that shows and limits or puts parameters around what they can access, those sorts of things, are those generally exempt from those parameters, or are those things that you have to go in and kind of exempt or accept that our software will look over, like the Go Guardian, will it look past those so that when kids take those things home, parents can access if they need them?
In our case, I go through the vetting process, because are those sites that are going to require the kid to sign in? And if the kid's signing in, what information is being collected? Now,
Right.
if it's just general things, I could quickly look over it and say, okay, there's no content in here that can be very questionable,
Right.
or images that could be questionable. And then we can put that in the whitelist if it's not already whitelisted.
Okay.
Thank you guys for answering that. Before we move on, it looks like Scott had a question about if anybody had seen documentable research that demonstrated enhanced student performance utilizing technology versus classic instructional methods, if you wanted to answer that real quick.
To Erica's point, I mean, it's deeply important that we understand who's doing the research, who's funding the research. Most of the evidence has focused on specific technologies and specific interventions where we've compared, say, a traditional classroom environment to, say, the use or the application of a specific tool to support in a specific way. So there are many studies that have found particular tools, for example, such as those aimed at reading intervention and supporting kids who have like many different phonics learning needs within one classroom to use a particular technology. Their rates of growth are higher than in a classroom where a teacher is trying to do that themselves. But the research tends to be application or intervention specific so that you can compare that intervention versus a lack of intervention. There is an organization called What Works Clearinghouse, funded by the national government, that does a ton of work looking at specific tools, applications, curriculum, and there is a lot of nationally funded research that is happening right now, where, you know, again, it's we're never going to replace the value of human-to-human interaction and a kid who is a novice getting to work with an expert who sees them and deeply knows them. And that's not always true for every single classroom experience in terms of the resources we have. And there are lots of folks out there who are trying to address challenges and access to expertise and support. And so there are ed tech products that have zero evidence, and then there are ed tech products that have a lot of evidence that's done on a peer-reviewed basis. There are also things called meta-analyses, which look across lots and lots of studies that are peer-reviewed and academically done. The one that I was referring to earlier means that all 2013, which is then replicated in 2021, looked at kids learning online versus kids learning in traditional settings, and did find that the results were comparable. And in some cases, kids progressed more when supported in online and blended methodologies, which is when you're in a classroom using technology. That's a very blunt study looking across lots and lots of products, but there is a lot of different types of evidence to look for. And to Dean's point, education teams deciding which applications to use should be looking at those data and demanding it from these technology companies before we even give kids access.
This is Chris. I'll just add on one point. It's a little different than the point Beth made, but I think relevant to this discussion, which is, you know, there is also research out there that suggests that unsupervised internet use leads to adverse outcomes among young people, and that low levels of parental monitoring as a whole can lead to particularly acute outcomes. You know, there's a really sad study about rises in suicide rate among young adolescents, which is a fairly new phenomenon, and you know, particularly sad one. But part of what they are trying to unpack are some of the various things that they think contribute to it. And truthfully, you know, unsupervised internet use could well be one of those. And so my point is, you know, I think there's lots to be said about the extent to which technology can and should be used both in the classroom and at home. My position is, if we're gonna send home the devices with kids, we need to make it as easy as possible for parents to be able to supervise their young people on those devices, just about as easy as it is on a personal device. And I just don't think that's the state of things today. And I think more often than not, it takes an investment in some additional tools in order to make sure that parents can do that. And when kids are supervised online, I think you're cutting down, you know, the vast majority of potential harms. And so to me, you know, it's a worthy investment.
If I may just flip this role for a moment. Katie has a comment in chat that says, what about beyond instruction and the movement to most everything online? to accommodate learning management systems that create efficiencies but don't focus on learning. Can you be a little provide more insight to that question?
Yeah, and I think hopefully I can be articulate. It's somewhat related to the vast amount of screen time that students are getting, but like even thinking at an elementary level, what we're really doing with a lot of the kids is teaching them how to function in an office environment. Make sure you scan this and get it in the system. And it does cause a lot of frustration for kids. And, you know, sometimes they don't want to engage in the learning content because they're just really tired of like, I just have to scan this and click this button and do these things that just aren't really relevant to the content in my class. And so I am really curious. I mean, we've just had this massive shift to kind of paper-based, some online, to everything is online in many cases. So I'm just curious, like, how does that actually affect overall learning? And I would assume there's not an answer. As Beth said, a lot of the research is dependent on a specific intervention or a program, but there's a big difference in what our kids are experiencing with being in these learning management systems all day and that compliance part.
I know in this school district, you know, it was interesting, and I'm going to jump back to 2020. We all know how schools shut down in Kansas and across the country, basically. And you had a lot of that dependency on that learning management system. And we kind of continued to make that available to our teachers, but the vast majority of them have very little to do with it. They're still more hands-on. You know, I kind of tease them in some ways when they kind of question, you know, budgets. Where's our budget money going? And I want to say, look in your recycle bin or the trash can, because the boxes of reams of paper have not changed since we've returned, you know. So in some school districts, I completely agree with you that it's so vastly, they're just interacting with the learning management system and not so much the hands-on and that type stuff. Whereas in our rural school district, some teachers use that some of the time. You may have a sprinkling of some that use it quite often, but you have still a percentage of them. And I'll be honest, our school district over the last 4 or 5 years, we've went from being a very similar aged faculty to a wide range staff now. And even some of the younger ones don't even deal with the LMS. And I've taught for 8 years, I taught a class or technology in the classroom integration class at Sterling College to pre-service students. And it was, everybody says, well, that'll be an easy class because they already know how to use it. No, they don't. But I found myself not wanting to even use the LMS there. The only reason I did was because I had to for the college, where I was more the hands-on. And I know still, again, like I said, with the paper usage, at least in our school district, that's all I can speak for, is LMS isn't heavily used as a whole.
Yeah, I think LMS utilization varies a lot from district to district. Katie, I feel you as a spirit new as a fourth grader who loathes all of those tasks. I think that this is where developmentally appropriate really comes into around policies, developmentally and pedagogically, like important, right? What we would hope for a high schooler as they enter the world of work, potentially the world of credentialing, certification, environments like these, is that they actually develop more and more facility with those types of systems as part of their digital readiness. I think when we get to the elementary age classroom, you begin to talk about trade-offs between organizing centrally on an LMS for things like disruptions like we've experienced versus what kids might actually find most valuable and what educators might find most valuable. And so I think there's a degree to which just I wanted to acknowledge there's a difference for a third grader versus an 11th grader, and schools making good decisions about that is really important.
All right. Well, it's about 5:05, so we're ready to kind of shift into our next section. So first, I want to just really say thank you to our panelists. We appreciate you guys taking time out of your day, sharing your expertise, and it's really just fantastic thoughts. Um, we're going to go ahead now. We're going to move into our breakout room discussions. And as we do this, we're going to kind of focus our conversation around potential policy recommendations. And today, we really want to focus on exploring the topic of parental oversight regarding district-issued devices, reflecting on breakout sessions, the panelists' insights, the research, and the discussions. What key points or considerations about parental oversight should be included in the final report? So basically, in the final report, what are we wanting to look at in terms of parental oversight? So we're going to go ahead and let Michaela send us over to breakout rooms. And again, thank you to our panelists for being here today.
Okay, it looks like we have most everybody back from our breakout rooms. So I'm going to kick it back to Commissioner Watson, who's now on, to give us more of an update.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I apologize for not being here as we started the session today. I'm actually, I take 2 weeks during each year, one in the fall, one in the spring, and I visit schools. And I'm visiting 23 schools this week. And today I'm actually with you from Central Alberta, where I just met with 6 students to talk about screen time. So I've been engaging everywhere I go with students to just find out their opinions, and they've shared greatly. I want to thank you for all your work. You know, we're going to be transitioning now over the next several weeks to actually writing the report of guidance and engaging in more deep discussions about what that guidance should be or what those recommendations should be to the state board. And as we engage in those important discussions, you know, around education, technology, and use, it's really essential that we continue to listen to multiple perspectives, especially those that don't align to what our personal beliefs might be around this topic. And I think we've tried to bring you a diversity of opinion in this so that we all kind of broaden our thoughts. It's critical that we approach all this information with a very critical and thoughtful mindset. Organizations and individuals, as they participate, should carefully consider both our own perspectives and then, of course, any potential influences that any of our panelists would have or any of our own people here on the task force would have. All of our collective experiences, of course, give bias, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm looking to Dr. Hill. Bias is not necessarily bad. We just have to know that we all have it, and we bring it from whatever our perspectives. Being informed and coming to good conclusions then around writing our recommendations would be examining all these various viewpoints and conducting our own research to ensure that our decisions that we make truly serve the best interests of students and educators. So thank you. Transparency is key to this process. We should always continue to ask questions, especially when something's not clear. And let's just continue this journey as engaging as critical thinkers and learners as we get ready to prepare this report. So, Brian and Ava, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. And as always, we're going to have our note takers compile all of the suggestions and main points from the breakout room discussions, and we'll present those back to you at the beginning of our next meeting. And we also wanted to mention that there are a few topics that have come up continuously, even if they weren't part of our breakout discussion. So for example, the breakout rooms have had a lot of discussion about emergency scenarios and possible exemptions. And because these have come up several times, we want you to be prepared to discuss recommendations for those topics at our future meetings as we come to more of a consensus on a plan. But thank you all so much for being here this week, and we will see you at our next meeting on October 3rd when we'll start to formulate our final report.
Thank you. You can just stay on the Zoom for a while. We can debrief here on Zoom and not in person today. So thank you.